case, on the bank transcript, I'm on page number 51. Now, she asked a question right here. She says, well, if the farmer deposits the promissory note, that was money in the bank. The bank president says, I'm not following you. Well, I'm probably not following her either. See, this is the difference. You really have to understand accounting, and that's why I give you the bookkeeping entries, and I have other cassette tapes, going over the bookkeeping entries and things like this. You really need that truth course. Because that truth course that I have, I'm actually teaching you how to teach a CPA how to become an expert witness in court. And if you really want to know this thing well, you want to know it as well as any CPA would. And if you know how to train a CPA how to become an expert witness in court, then you ought to know a lot. And that's about 15 hours of cassette tapes that I have. It's only designed for you. You have to sign a confidentiality just like you did to get these cassette tapes. You cannot copy those. Nobody else can listen to them. But she asked the question the wrong way again. So I'm going to show you this. Now, I can show you book learning, but there's nothing like the practical thing, the real thing that's actually going on to show you. See, you really let the cat out of the bag. You telegraph. It's like you're going to go to punch somebody, and you pull your arm back, as a fist, and then you go to hit them. You telegraph what you're going to do ahead of time. The guy's there waiting for you. You say, oh, I know what they're up to. I know how to answer this. Let's redo this whole question. Let's do this the right way. What do you say if she said, well, let me ask you this, Mr. Banker, Mr. Bank President. If the farmer walked into the bank, handed you a $100,000 negotiable instrument, and let's say you accepted that $100,000 negotiable instrument and deposited it into his checking account, would the bank's assets and liabilities increase by $100,000? He would say yes. And if that were to occur at that moment in time, would you believe that the bank loaned anything of value to the farmer? He's going to say no. If the farmer came in with a $100,000 negotiable instrument, let's say a check or whatever, and deposited that into his checking account, and he withdrew the $100,000 and returned the $100,000 to himself, do you believe at that point in time the bank loaned that farmer anything of any value? He's going to say no. And if that transaction actually occurred, and let's say the farmer signed a $100,000 promissory note, but that was the transaction I just previously described actually occurred, do you believe the bank loaned the promissory, or loaned anything of value, or do you believe the bank loaned any bank asset to the farmer? He's going to have to say no. See, I said loan the bank's asset. See, accepting an asset. See, remember, let's do it another way. If the farmer loaned the bank a $100,000 $100,000 negotiable instrument. See, why are we saying negotiable instrument? The reason is the bank president doesn't know if we're talking about the promissory note, doesn't know if we're talking about a bank draft, doesn't know if we're talking about a check. He has no idea. So you want to kind of use a little trickery too, and you might say, negotiable instrument or check. He said, or check. And then you come back and say, well, because see, if you ask it another way, say something like, well, if the farmer had a $100,000 negotiable instrument and he decided to loan that to the bank, would the bank assets and liabilities increase by $100,000? Well, absolutely yes. So if I deposit this negotiable instrument or loan the negotiable instrument to the bank, in both cases, is it true that the bank assets and liabilities would increase by $100,000? And he would say yes. And if the negotiable instrument was deposited or loaned to the bank, in your opinion, would the bank there'd be a liability showing that the bank owes this customer the $100,000 that was deposited or loaned to the bank, and he's going to have to say yes. So if the bank accepted a $100,000 negotiable instrument that was either loaned or deposited to the bank, then the bank would show a $100,000 liability saying they owe that customer the $100,000. And if the $100,000 was returned to the bank customer, did the bank loan any asset to the customer? Or would you rather say the bank returned the loan to the customer, or return the money that was deposited to the customer? And now you see how I'm twisting. Now I'm saying return the money instead of the negotiable instrument. He's going to say, well, yeah, that's true. All right, let's say the same exact situation, but the customer signed a promissory note saying, I'm going to pay the bank back $100,000, but the bank never loaned their $100,000 to this customer. What happened was the bank accepted a $100,000 negotiable instrument from the customer, which was lent to the bank, and it was returned. The value was returned back to the customer. Did the bank, in your opinion, loan $100,000 of legal tender or any bank asset to the customer loan to obtain the promissory note? And they're going to have to say no. That's how these questions ought to be asked, but just saying the way she asked it right here, see, you telegraph. You're already talking about promissory notes. You should switch the word from promissory note over to negotiable instrument, and they don't know what you're talking about. So now if they come back and say, that's right, if the customer lent a $100,000 promissory note to the bank, and the bank gave back $100,000 to the customer, that's a loan to the customer. And say, you're kidding me. If I deposit a $100,000 check in my checking account and I withdraw the money, it's a loan to me? See? And now the guy's going, well, no, that's not really true. Well, that's what you just got done saying. Isn't that true? See, now you got him under perjury. And now if he comes back and says, well, that's right, if this negotiable instrument worked like this, it was really not a loan from the bank to the customer. And I said, okay. So if I had a $100,000 promissory note, if I signed it, and I'm holding on to it right now, okay, I haven't relinquished it and given to the bank. And let's say the bank refuses to loan 1 cent of legal tender or other depositor's money to obtain the promissory note. Who legally owns the promissory note? The borrower or the bank? Okay, and how much legal tender or other depositor's money must the bank first loan to the customer before the promissory note transfers ownership from the borrower to the bank? How much legal tender? And in this transaction, did the borrower give the bank any asset that the bank recorded as receiving an asset from the borrower that was used to fund a loan? See, now they got a problem, because if there's a new asset, there's new liability. He's already saying that if there's a new asset, new liability, then somebody either had to make a deposit or they had to make a loan to the bank. The only other thing could be a gift or a theft. So you got four possibilities: a deposit, a loan, a gift, or a theft. I want to know which one it is. Well, we do what the bank says. We do what the government says we can do. Does the government allow you to breach agreements? Does the government allow you to be involved in deceptive practices? Does the government allow you to do this? And when they get done, no. And you say, well, what law allows you to do this? Now they have to go into the bankruptcy of the United States, which no court wants discussed. And they got another huge problem. So then you say, well, show me under the bank loan agreement where the bank loaned nothing of value to obtain this bank loan agreement, no bank asset. The bank got this thing for free, and they made an exchange instead of a loan, and then they charged as if there was a loan, but really there was an exchange. Show me where that was agreed to here. And he's going to go, I don't see that. But that's our policy. That's what we do. So you're telling me you had intention of telling this customer over here there was actually a loan, but you knew you were going to loan nothing of value to obtain this. You were actually going to make an exchange and then tell him that the exchange was a loan. Is that what really happened here? So if I exchange $100 worth of American money for equal value of German money, is that an exchange? Is that like a money changer? Yeah, that's a money changer. Well, if I exchange cash, $100 of cash for $100 of check, would that be a money changing type of operation for one form of money for another form of money? Yes, it would be. Well, then if I change one type of asset, value for one type of asset so for a value of another type of asset of equal value, would that be an exchange or would that be a loan in your opinion? He's going to have to say, well, that was really an exchange. So you're telling me that we have to make an exchange and we get charged a fee of 100% plus interest for that exchange. And wouldn't that mean that the bank is if the banks could do this continuously, they'd end up owning the liens on nearly every home, car, farm, and business all across the United States. The people would have huge debt. The people would have very little, if any, money. The banks could increase and decrease the money supply and force people out on the street for their own capital gain. Is that how the bank operates? So the bank, you're telling me then, Mr. Banker, you start redefining words all over this. Any other words you redefined? From the ordinary meaning of words? See, now they got a problem. So how is this poor guy over here supposed to understand that a loan with a neighbor means one thing, but a loan with a bank means the opposite? How is he supposed to know that? Is that in Black's Law Dictionary? Is that, he doesn't operate as a banker, so how is he supposed to know that you just got done redefining words? And the words in this contract mean the opposite of what they ordinarily mean. How do you think he's supposed to know that? See, this is the type of thing you have to discuss. All right, so let me take a look here. I'm on page 50 still of the actual transcript. So to summarize it, he said there was no money created. They loaned the bankers money, and I want to know can the banks' demand deposit accounts, checking account balances, savings accounts, CDs increase without depositing checks or money or funds that they receive from bank customers? And they're going to have to say, no, they can't increase those liability accounts without receiving some asset on the bank's books that they receive from a customer. And if you receive an asset from the customer on the bank's books with an offsetting liability, does that mean that they owe an asset of equal value to match that liability to that customer? And they're going to have to say yes. You basically have right there pretty much destroyed that banker, but the judge and the jury may not have figured it out just yet. So we got to go on. All right, I'm on page 50, and he answers at the top. He signs a note securing it with collateral. We then, in turn, deposit that money into his account. I don't know what he means by deposit that money. What does that mean? I don't know. So what do you might ask him, what do you mean by that money? When you say deposit that money, where was the source of deposit of that money come from? Now, if you take a look at the Federal Reserve Bank's own publications, it talks about you deposit checks, deposit money, deposit cash. So when you mean deposit money, you're talking about like a check or cash or something like this that is recorded as a bank asset. Now, once they agree with that, then they know they deposited the promissory note on the bank's books as an asset. So you can say, well, did you deposit the promissory note on the bank's books as an asset? See, now he's going to start playing with the word deposit. But he used the word deposit, so now you get to use the word deposit. All right, on page 51, the paralegal comes back and says, okay, you have used the word signed. Is there a difference between signature and autograph? He says, I don't know. Does your business evolve around signatures? Yes, we require a lot of signatures, yes. So how would you define signature? Someone signing their name. Is that the definition of autograph? Probably, I don't know. You know what? She took off on the wrong thing right here. This is where the fatal flaw occurred, right here. So you got to understand, I'm a numbers man. The paralegal is a legal person. So she's right on the signature thing. And she's on saying, is there any blank in that agreement? Because if there's a blank space in the agreement, you can get it null and void. So she was on the signature and the blank space, trying to get it null and void. And I'm saying as an accountant, that doesn't make a whole lot of difference. If you're the judge can stand up and say, you know what, Mr. Farmer, you got $100,000 from this banker. And now you're trying to say there's a technicality on the signatures in the contract, and you're saying because of that you get $100,000 for free and you don't have to pay it back. I object to that as a judge. I don't care what the agreement is. That's what they're going to say. I'll make up an agreement as a judge because, Mr. Farmer, you're going to pay that banker back the $100,000 you got. I don't care. He gave you $100,000. You got to pay it back so they can pay back their depositors. We're not going to scam the FDIC insurance company, just because you want something for free. And that's really what the judge is saying. Now, I understand where the paralegal's coming from, and that's a great question in a deposition, but not in court. Until after you've gotten everything else you want done in court, and then maybe, possibly, you might want to ask those type of questions on the signature. But that's the last thing you want to do. You have him right now on the money issue. So when he said, deposit that money into his checking account, I want to know where this money came from. Did it come from who? Bank or borrower? Now, if they had to sell the promissory note first to get the cash and deposit the cash, then that proves they loaned nothing of value to obtain the promissory note. They converted it into another asset, and then they exchanged the cash into a checking account balance and gave back a check. So that proves to me they loaned nothing to obtain the promissory note. They made an exchange. If they take the promissory note recorded as a bank asset, we know they exchanged it, the value for promissory note that can be exchanged for cash, and use that cash or that value that they can be exchanged for cash to issue a check. So there was an exchange that took place. So we know there's an exchange that took place. Our goal now is to drive the point home, to ask the right questions so the bank president is going to say, well, if this occurred, we would not legally own the promissory note. But if this occurred, we would legally own the promissory note. So before you even get this far, long time ago, in the very beginning, you want to basically say, Mr. Banker, I don't understand how this works. Let's just so I don't understand money, stuff like this. Let's just say, Mr. Banker, here's a promissory note. You hold up a sheet of paper, it says PN, promissory note, right in front of the jury. And you say, okay, I signed this promissory note that I'm going to pay you back $100,000. Let's just presume that you refuse to loan me your $100,000 to obtain this promissory note. At that point in time, would you say that you own the promissory note or the borrower still owns the promissory note? Okay? I want to know when the ownership of this promissory note transfers from borrower to the bank. What did the bank have to do? And they're going to say, well, we have to give you a check. Okay, so you have to give me a check first for $100,000 before you actually own this promissory note? See, they just admitted to check kiting if they're following the Federal Reserve Bank's policies and procedures. See, if they do not own the promissory note, they cannot deposit it first and use it to fund a check because they don't legally own the promissory note. He just admitted it. He doesn't own it until he first gives me a check. The check has no value behind it until they first deposit the promissory note. So they don't own it. He just admitted they don't own the promissory note. That's what I want to get out of that bank president. They don't legally own the promissory note. The farmer still legally owns it. The bank may have possession of it. They may have it in their vault. They may have it in their files, but they don't legally own it. And that's the Tom Schaaf mechanism that we're working on. Now, they might say, well, it doesn't make any difference as long as we get a check. Well, it does too make a difference. Absolutely. Okay, now I want to ask you another question, Mr. Banker. Let's say I sign this promissory note, and I agree to pay back $100,000. Do I first, before you give me this check, do I first have to give you something of value that's worth $100,000 that can be exchanged for $100,000 of value, and use that to fund the check? And then you use that check to obtain, to give back to me? Is that what has to happen first? Or do you use your asset to fund the promissory note, to fund the bank loan check, and then you give me the bank loan check? Who provides the asset, the $100,000 asset to fund that bank loan check? Is it the bank or the borrower? And if they object to that, say, well, don't you first have to have $100,000 of cash or cash equivalent to fund that check before you issue it to me? Yes, you do. Now you go into those questions I just got done mentioning. Who provides the $100,000 asset, cash or cash equivalent, to fund that check? Is it the bank or the borrower? If they come back and say, well, it's the borrower. Wait a minute, you're telling me the borrower provides $100,000 that's deposited into a checking account, used to fund a check. The check is given to the farmer, and you're claiming the bank loaned their money? Isn't money recorded as a bank asset? Isn't legal tender recorded as a bank asset? They're going to have to say, well, yeah. Now we got them under perjury. Because, see, we want them to make false statements. If they made false statements here in court today, obviously they've been making false statements on all these other things that we've been talking about. So now we have material facts. So, Mr. Banker, do you believe it'd be a material fact to know if the farmer has to provide a $100,000 asset that is either cash or can be exchanged for cash that's going to fund this check to the farmer? Or do you believe it would be a material fact to know if the bank was going to use their asset to fund the check to the farmer? Would it be, in your opinion, do you think that would be a material fact to know in this agreement? And if they say yes, man, I tell you, you got them under deceptive trade practices. If they say no, it's not material. Are you telling me it's not material that you could take a $100,000 asset from the farmer without his knowledge, deposit into a checking account, withdraw the money without his knowledge, and take that check and give it back to him and then claim the bank loaned the bank's money to fund that check when really the money came from the farmer? Doesn't that check have no value without someone providing an asset worth $100,000? They're going to be exchanged for cash. They're going to have to say yes. Wouldn't it be material if I have a checking account, if I deposit money into a checking account, or if somebody took money from somebody else without their knowledge and put it in my checking account and I withdrew the money and kept it for me? Wouldn't that be a material thing as to where the capital came from and whose pocket it came from? Wouldn't that change the cost and risk? If the farmer had to provide the $100,000 to fund the check back to himself, and that's called a loan from the bank to the farmer, wouldn't that change the cost and risk compared to if the bank provided their capital to fund the bank loan check to the farmer? Wouldn't that change the cost and risk to the farmer? Because in one case, the farmer lost $100,000, and the other case, I said, what do you mean they lost $100,000? If somebody took $100,000 from a farmer without his knowledge, deposited into a checking account, withdrew the money, and gave the same the value of the $100,000 to the farmer as a loan, then the farmer really lost $100,000, didn't he? But if somebody else used their $100,000 that they loaned to the farmer instead of the farmer's $100,000, the farmer didn't lose $100,000 of capital in the deposit of the checking account, did he? So what does that mean? Well, the $100,000 the farmer lost means the bank's got a $100,000 lien on the real estate without ever giving up a cent of their own money. That means they get to own the homes, car, farms, and businesses all across the United States without ever giving up a cent. That means they get to own all the property. If I kept on stealing, I'd end up owning everything. And how can they get $100,000 free from the farmer without his knowledge? Where is that? And they don't know how to answer that. All right, so she went off in a whole wrong direction right here. So the famous question is what? You point to the promissory note and you point to the dollar amount. You say, how much, in your opinion, how much legal tender or other depositor's money? You just read it into the court record. Did the bank have to loan to the farmer first before the bank legally owned the promissory note? Please read that into the record. Now, if they come back and say zero, you telling me the bank can loan zero money to legally own this promissory note and they legally own it? So you telling me they own this thing and they never gave up a cent? And the bank got how much value when they legally owned this thing without giving up a cent? They got $100,000 value from the farmer, isn't that right? They deposit on their bank books as an asset. They create a new bank liability. How can you have a bank liability? Does a bank liability mean the bank owes money to the person who provided this asset to the bank? And they're going to have to say yes. That means they owe the farmer $100,000. So if they pay that bank liability, all loans are canceled. IOU, that's the promissory note. For the bank, IOU, demand deposit account, two loans exchanged, pay off both IOUs. IOUs cancel each other, both bank loans are paid. Now, if you're going to go into the signatures later, what you do is you say, do you think this signature gives validity to this agreement? Do you know what the agreement is? Can you please tell me what you believe the agreement is? That's how you're going to use this signature. Okay? Now, if they come back and they say, well, I have to give $100,000 of cash or legal tender or check first before they legally own this promissory note, then they might later on try and say, well, we monetized the note. In other words, we still recorded the promissory note as a bank asset. So that means you still received $100,000 of value from the farmer that was used to fund the check. So the check then, well, if you're going to loan other depositors money, assets and liabilities have to decrease. Here, assets and liabilities increase, so that means you actually received a deposit or a loan from the farmer to the bank. Isn't that correct? The only other way they can do it is they stole it. They don't want to admit to stealing it, so they see if it was stolen, they have to pay income tax on it. So they want to say, well, really it was a loan from the customer to the bank and ask the new bank liability, so they don't owe any income tax on it. See, they're trying to skirt this issue. They're trying to be on two sides of the fence at the same time, and we're not going to let them be on both sides, either one or the other. So since they did not pay income tax on it because it was stolen, then obviously it was loaned from the farmer to the bank. So you're going to catch them at their own game. You just got to be much better than they are. They have to try to use absolute total confusion, and you have to get very specific and define words and say, how about, in your opinion, how about this? Now this paralegal, when she asked the bank president questions, I would say he answered about less than half the questions, and she went on to the next thing. No, you got to sit there and say, I'm not going on to the next question until you give me specifics. I asked you a yes or no question. Now you can answer yes, you can answer no, and then you can define what you want, but I want a yes or I want a no. Now, if the banker doesn't know what the agreement is, they can't argue with you. And now you got your expert to say what really happened. Now, let's face it, if you went and stole a car and you knew what the transaction was and your friend purchased the car to try to, it's like a hot potato trying to get around this thing, and everybody knew what was going on, I put you guys on the witness stand and I said, okay, you guys know what the specifics are. I'm going to ask you specifics. And you know you could go to jail if you're caught. What's your answer going to be? I know nothing. Like Sergeant Holtz on Hogan's Heroes. I know nothing. Or are you going to try and answer in such a confused, ambiguous way that nobody can figure out what it is you're talking about? So my whole thing is I want the banker to admit they don't legally own that promissory note. That's my goal. So you have to do it in such a way, and you have to be able to do it in maybe 5 or 10 questions before they figure out where you're coming from, where you're coming at, and you ask it in such a way they don't know if you're talking about if you deposit a promissory note or a negotiable instrument or a check into a regular checking account or a loan account. And you ask it in such a way they don't know where you're coming from. And so they can't answer. No matter how they answer, they're going to answer it wrong. And that's how you want to do this. It's that simple. So you use the word negotiable instrument instead of promissory note when you're talking about, the bank's books. Say, well, if I did this with a negotiable instrument, would that be like a loan from the customer to the bank or a deposit from the customer to the bank? And in both cases, the customer can get the value of that asset back. And they're going to have to say yes. And then you're just going to simply switch it in and say that negotiable instrument is like the promissory note. And you start reading Black's Law Dictionary what the definition is of negotiable instrument. Negotiable instrument is this. Okay, here's a promissory note. And then they'll come back and say, well, no, now it's different. What do you mean it's different? You said earlier you have to loan this amount of legal tender or other depositors' money to obtain ownership of the promissory note. Right here, you said you follow the Federal Reserve Bank's policies and procedures. Right here, we have what they are, the bookkeeping entries. You said you recorded the promissory note as a bank asset. That's exactly what the Federal Reserve Bank's policies and procedures are. We know there has to be a new liability. Liability means you owe the customer or the bank who, brought that asset to the bank, they owe them the money. Did the bank ever have any intention of repaying the farmer the $100,000? And they're going to have to come back and say, well, no, not really. Now you got them on promissory fraud because they never intended to fulfill that written loan agreement. They're trying to deceive you. They don't want you to know what really, really happened. They're trying to get this deception, this deceit, this falsehood, because they know. So what they do is they basically say, well, this transaction, whatever it is legal now because we decided it's legal. I say if it's legal, then put it in the agreement so people know what the agreement is. And they're trying to say we don't have to because we just redefine words and nobody knows what we mean, but that's the normal status of what we do. No, I say the agreement is the highest law of the land. And if people truly understood what was going on, they go, we wouldn't agree to this. We would vote it out in a heartbeat as Americans. We'd vote out those people, forcing this upon us. That's the issue of what Tom Schaaf is talking about. Well, on page 53, she asked the question, well, what's the terms of the note? I think I would rather ask the question, according to this agreement, who was to receive funds or money from whom? According to this transaction. Who is supposed to receive funds or money from what to whom? And who's supposed to loan exactly what to whom? And could you please describe to me the money trail as to what was supposed to be happening right here, or the money or asset or negotiable instrument trail, or what do you want to call it? Anything that has value is going to be transferred from one person to another person. Can you please describe how that works? You said you knew all about the transaction, so can you please tell me? Now they're going to leave out the part that they don't want to talk about. They're going to admit that again right on the witness stand, and they're under the oath to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And then you try to wiggle around saying, well, if this and this didn't happen, then would the borrower still own the promissory note? So you want to keep on coming back and say, well, if this and this and this happened, would the borrower still own the promissory note? Would it still be his? On page 54, again, they're talking about as an asset. See, under the loan account, on the balance sheet, they have a subtitle called loan account. It's like cash, loan account, and then, other assets like, cars or building, as far as assets. Assets is something you can touch, feel, sell. If you can sell it, it's an asset. So they have a thing called loan accounts, and they put the promissory notes under those loan accounts. You can't record something as a bank asset without recording a new liability. Assets and liabilities have to equal. The debit is the asset, the credit is the liability. So a lot of times when they say we gave you credit, they credited your account. That's what they mean. But I'm saying what was debited to the account? Guess what? Promissory note. You provided the capital to fund the check. So they're wasting an awful lot of time right here. And then on page 54 at the bottom, line 24, she says, but what I'm asking you, is there a journal ledger? Well, there is no such thing as a journal ledger. It's called a journal entry or general ledger. So if he really wants to get around this, he can just say no, because technically she asked a bad question. Another way of doing this is you might just say, are there any type of accounting books that would record the promissory note as an asset? That shuts them up right there. He'd have to come back and say yes. And you can come back and say, okay, let's say the bank wants to fund a check. I'm a customer, I go to the bank, and I say I want a $1,000 check, and I'm going to provide the funds for the check. Would the bank record the funds as an asset, offset with a new bank liability to fund, and then that would be used to issue a check to that same person? Would that be the transaction? They're going to have to say yes. And if that were to occur, did the bank loan anything to that customer? No, they did not. Because the customer is the one who provided the capital to the bank that was actually used to fund the check. Isn't that correct? They're going to say yes. And then you bring in the thing about the promissory note. Well, gee, if we just simply switch the word funds to the word promissory note that was deposited as a bank asset, then wouldn't you equally have to agree that the bank didn't loan any of their money to obtain the promissory note? Really, the borrower was the one who funded the loan? They're going to have to say yes. And once you, Mr. Banker, agree that, doesn't it work that banks pay out interest on savings accounts and CDs? They're going to say yes. Isn't it true that the bankers loan out depositors' money to borrowers? And they're going to say yes. And isn't it true that the borrowers are supposed to pay the bank back the principal and the interest? They're going to say yes. And doesn't the bank pay back the original people who deposited funds at the bank that was used to loan out to borrowers? And they're going to have to say yes. If they say no, you're going to have a lot of fun with them. You're going to say, are you telling me, Mr. Banker, people come in, customers, to provide a bank asset at the bank, offset with a new bank liability, and they're using these funds or these assets to loan out to other people? The borrowers pay the bank back, but the bank never pays back the customer who brought the asset to the bank, whose value was loaned out to borrowers? And you just kind of scratch your head like, you're telling me that, they never get their money back, huh? Well, if I brought funds into the bank, are you telling me then that bankers accept assets from customers and deposit them or use those to issue checks, and they never give bank statements showing that the bank received those assets or investments from those bank customers? And they never pay them back? And you scratch your head some more. Now do you think my client would agree to give the bank a $100,000 asset, the bank used that to fund a $100,000 check, and the bank returns that $100,000 check back to the customer, this farmer. And then the farmer agreed that the bank loaned the farmer $100,000, and the bank keep the $100,000 that the bank got from the farmer for free. You think this farmer agreed to that? And they're going to have to come back and say, well, yes. And then you come back and say, well, earlier you said money. And then you ask what money is. Is money recorded as a bank asset or as a bank liability? So now they're going to have to try and agree that the bank liability is the money, not the asset. So if the bank liability is now money and not the bank asset, that means any cash deposit at the bank is no longer money. It's no longer legal tender. But no jury is going to buy that story. Let's take a look at this a little bit more. On page 55, starting at the top, she asks the question, yes. So where are the terms that delineate this procedure? It's talking about recording the promissory note as bank asset. The bank president comes back and says, I'm not following you. I don't understand what you're saying. She says, well, let me try this another angle. Was the farmer informed of the terms that control what happens to the promissory note? Bank president says, sure. If he pays it off, we give it back to him. Now listen to this. He is dancing around this, okay? And he's beating around the bush. He's not answering the question again. So she has to make him answer this question. She's not doing it. She comes back and says, well, that's the end of the story. Can we go to the beginning of the story? May I ask you, did the farmer agree to have the promissory note deposited and listed as an asset? The bank president comes back and says he agreed to take the money for the note. That was not an answer to the question. He goes off on some other tangent, not talking about what she asked. Okay, she comes back and she says, Your Honor, may I ask the question, not to rephrase the question? I'm having a hard enough time reading this. The court says, well, I don't know that I guessed the answer. I'm not sure I understood the question myself. Well, she's asking questions that nobody really understands. She's ticking off the judge, and once you start getting the judge upset, he's not going to be very helpful to you in the future. If you go back to what I was saying earlier, it says, did he agree to, I give you the asset, I give you the capital to fund the loan and give it back, and do you think he'd agree to something, like this? Would you? And you switch it around. Mr. Banker, let's say you come to me for a $100,000 loan. Would you agree to give me $100,000 and I return the $100,000 to you, stating that I loaned you $100,000? Would you agree to that? See, you switch it around, and there's in front of the jury, and he's going to be, no, we don't do it that way. Well, why not? Isn't that what you did to him? But you wouldn't do it because that's not a good business deal. Isn't that true? Well, don't say that. That's. Say, do you think that is a smart business deal for the customer to give somebody $100 and that? I walk up to a stranger, I give him $100, they give me back $100, and I claim now the stranger loaned me $100. Do you think that's a good business deal? No, it's not. Now, he might just come back and say, that's how banks do business. Well, do banks, in the agreement, they said they're going to loan money to him, right? Where is it in the agreement that he's going to loan himself his own money, and then he has to pay back a third party the principal and interest that never loaned him 1 cent? Where is that in the agreement? But that's really, truly what happened, isn't it? And now they got a problem. So she's kind of like asking bad questions right here. All right. So she asked another question again. And was the farmer informed? Was the farmer given an opportunity to agree to allow the promissory note to serve as an asset on the bank? The court comes back and says, okay, Mr. Banker, if you The bank attorney objects, Your Honor, I can't even understand the question, much less. And then they come back and say, I'm sorry, I'm really very stupid here. You don't say you're stupid. You know? You want to come back and say, do you believe the farmer agreed to this? And before you even ask that, you want to say, is the transaction, the true transaction stated here in this agreement? And then you ask them the next question. Do you think an average ordinary person using ordinary meanings of words can understand what this agreement is? And then you go into these questions. Why are you asking that? Because if you say, is this the agreement? Do you believe all material facts are stated in this agreement? And do you think that an average ordinary person can, using ordinary meanings of words, can understand what this agreement is? Now, if they come back and says, no, not everything is stated in here, and the average person cannot understand what's in this agreement. Now they got to start explaining, and what is it they cannot understand? Now, you ask those two questions, and then you come back into the transaction, and then whatever it is in the transaction about recording the promissory note as an asset, blah, 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 blah. Then you come back later and you say, okay, now earlier, when you first started this, you said people can understand the ordinary meaning of the words and using ordinary definitions, and the average person can understand what's in this agreement. Now, please show me in the agreement where it specifically stated that the farmer funds the loan to himself, and he has to pay back a third party the principal and interest that never loaned 1 cent of their legal tender or other depositor's money to obtain the promissory note. Please show me where that's agreed to. And they can't. See, I want them to agree that they do not legally own that promissory note. That is what I'm after, and that's what I got to get. And I got to get the jury to see this injustice, this very wrong doing. And you got to get them to make statements beforehand saying, well, yeah, if this happened, the bank does not legally own the promissory note. The promissory note is going to transfer from the hands of the borrower to the bank when this happens. And you find out that this thing never happened. Now you go back to the judge, and this proffer that the judge talks about later says, basically the judge says, I don't understand what your defense is. Okay, we're going to go over the other side of this cassette tape. Remember, Tom Schaaf, www.bankfreedom.com, and you cannot copy this cassette tape, and nobody else can listen to this cassette tape by contractual agreement. Otherwise, it's like receipt of stolen goods and property, and I get real upset. I've known to cut off whole groups that have done that. Okay, let's go over to the other side of this cassette tape, please. All right, this is Tom Schaaf. This is from www.bankfreedom.com on the internet. And this is tape number 3, side number 2. And I'm on page 53 of the court of the Kansas court case. And again, we're asking people not to be calling up this farmer and asking all these questions because he does not want the telephone calls. This particular farmer helped me for 1 week. He and his friends input the materials for my volume number 1 into the computer to help me get started. I actually took it and retyped it word for word myself because I had to rewrite it a couple different times, but he helped me with the book, so I helped him a little bit in his particular court case. So he's sharing this information with us so that you can benefit from this as well. If you have email, it's going to be a different page, but page 56, and we go into it, our paralegal is asking a question to the bank attorney. If I come into your bank and if I deposit $1,000, do you give me a deposit book where you can keep track of what happens to this $1,000? He says, the bank president answers, I give you a deposit slip for $1,000. She should have come back at this point and says, do you credit my checking account for $1,000? And he'd probably say yes. And then she should come back with another question and say, if the bank receives funds from a customer which they record as a bank asset offset by new bank liability, do they give that bank customer a deposit slip and credit his checking account and send that checking account to him to show that deposit? And he'd probably come back and say yes, because he doesn't know what you're talking about at this point. Okay, you should have had a couple of those questions in there, but she did real good, though. She did a wonderful job. I'm not here trying to criticize her. You know, you guys, I tell you, book learning and actual court case is all different. And, you know, you're right there in front of the court case, and you're trying to think of these questions right off the top of your head, and that's not an easy thing to do. I probably should have written everything out, anticipating what they're going to say, but that takes a couple days in advance, and then you have to study it, and I didn't have time to do that. Okay, so she asked the question, okay, and when I come in, I want to withdraw the $100. He goes, huh? And she says, she asks the question, you take a withdrawal slip and you make a deduction from that $1,000 and give me $100. Is that correct? He says, yes. Do you still owe me $900? He answers, you still have $900 in the bank, yes. She asked the question, so do you owe me the other $900? He goes, uh-huh. You should ask, is that a yes or is that a no? That's what she should have said. Now, why are we asking these particular questions? I'm going to go on here. So the day that I made the deposit of $1,000, that was an asset of $1,000 to the bank. Is that correct? He says, no, that's a liability. She says, that's a liability because you owe it back to me? He said, that's right. Now, she did real good with this. This was 100% correct. She did real good, and you have to congratulate her for doing this. What she did is she showed that $100 bank liability is the bank owes me back the value of that asset that was earlier recorded as a bank asset. That's all she's saying. Now, why does she ask this question? Because this stops the bank from claiming that this bank IOU, this bank liability, this checking account balance is money. He admitted here it's not money. It is owing money. Money is recorded as a bank asset. So she did really good right here. And so you have to kind of congratulate her. But you should have asked some other questions, like you should ask, does the bank liability increase by $1,000? He should say yes. Does the bank liability mean the bank owes $1,000 of cash or legal tender? And he should have said yes. So I loaned the bank. Is it very, if I deposit $1,000 at the bank, is it basically economically the same or similar to that I loaned the bank $1,000? And if I loan the bank $1,000, I can get my $1,000 of cash back or value back. Now, why do I say value? Because they're not going to give you the exact same dollars. So you got to be very careful how you ask the question. If I just said, so I get my same $1,000 back, that's wrong, because if you put in $1,000 in the bank vault, they're going to probably, within the same day, they're going to give it to some other customer, and they're going to place it with somebody else's $1,000. So you're going to get $1,000 back, but it won't be the exact same dollars. Okay? But you get the same value back, and that's why I asked the question the way I did. So you want to come back and say, if I loaned the bank $1,000, is it basically the same thing as if I deposit $1,000 to the bank? In either case, that they would owe me back the $1,000. Is that true? Does the bank use anything other than cash as money? If you ask that, they're going to try and come back and say, well, the bank liability is money. We use it, we think of it as money. We think of it as money. We use it like money. They're going to use things like this. Using it like, thinking of it as this way, doesn't make it that. I can think of a dog is like a cat because they're both nice and friendly and about the same size, and both eat and poop. But that doesn't mean they're the same thing. So you got to be very, very careful about what you ask right here. So if I loan the bank $100, Do the bank liabilities increase by $100? Yes. And if I deposit $100 in the bank, does the bank liabilities increase by $100? Yes. So if I loan the bank $100, do the bank assets and liabilities increase by $100? Yes. And if I loan the bank or deposit $100 at the bank, do the bank assets and liabilities increase by $100? Yes. In either case, if I loan the bank the $100 or deposit $100, does the bank owe me back the value of $100? And they're going to have to say yes. So if the bank's assets increase, if the bank's assets and liabilities increase by $100, then would you agree or not that somebody then either loaned or deposited $100 at the bank? Any exceptions that you know of? See, now this is the problem. So if he doesn't come back and say, well, when we make a loan to the farmer, our assets and liabilities increase because we record the promissory note as an asset and there's new bank liability. Okay, if there is a new bank liability, do you pay income tax on that $1,000? Or do you record it, that offsetting liability, does that mean it's like a loan to the bank? Now, if there's a conversion of funds, they got to pay income tax on it because that's a theft. They got it for free. So if you really want, you could take off on those type of questions. I'm not saying you have to. I want them to know that you have that ability to do that. Now, if they come back and say, well, yeah, if I deposit or lend the bank something, assets and liabilities increase at the bank, and if it's a loan, then the promissory note's recorded as a bank asset, and the farmer gets his $1,000 or $100,000 or whatever. So then you can always come back and say, well, if the bank records an asset, a new asset they receive from a customer with a new bank liability, doesn't the liability mean that they owe that customer the value of that asset back? And then because it's a new asset, new liability, and doesn't that show the bank never loaned 1 cent of legal tender or other depositors money to obtain ownership of the promissory note? So if they deposited that promissory note, that's how they legally own it. But if you loaned them the promissory note, they still owe it back. But if you deposit it, they owe you the value back. So they owe you the value back, so they gave you back the value. That was that check. But they misinterpreted it and said it was a loan from the bank to you instead of return of capital that the bank accepted from you earlier. So you could have a lot of fun with that. So then you could actually say, well, a liability means that's a banker's debt, isn't that correct? So are you telling me every time the bank loans money, the banker's debts increase by the amount of the alleged loan that they loaned somebody? Is that correct? Mr. Banker, mathematically right here, if the bank paid the debt, the increased debt that they owe, if they paid that to the farmer, and if the farmer paid the bank, wouldn't that cancel out both loans? Or you might come back and say, well, really, that bank IOU owing money, that bank liability, isn't a liability like an IOU? Because you said the word like. And they'll probably say, yeah. So this promissory note says that the farmer owes the bank money, right? And owing you the money is like an IOU, owing the bank money, isn't that right? And they're going to give, yeah. And the bank liability is actually owing people money at, customers money that brought an asset to the bank that the bank recorded as an asset offset by liability. Isn't that correct? And they're going to have to say yes. So the bank liability is like an IOU, right? So in this case, the farmer's IOUs increase and the banker's IOUs increase. Isn't that correct? And if both people paid their IOUs, both debts would be canceled. Isn't that correct? Mr. Banker, do you have any proof that the bank paid off their liability or is it still outstanding? Outstanding means it's still there, still existing. Now, and they never paid their debt, and every time the banker's debts increased by, let's say, $100,000, that means they got a $100,000 lien on property for free. Isn't that true, Mr. Banker? And they're going to have to answer yes. So that means somebody owes money on that lien, and you owe money on the bank liability. Isn't that correct? And if both people paid their debt, both debts could cancel out. Isn't that correct? Did you cancel out the two loans? No, they didn't. Let's go on. I'm on page number 58 right now. It says, she asked the question, did you on direct say that the bank loaned the defendant's money? Now, you could rephrase the question. This doesn't really help a whole lot, because what do you mean loan money? Loan money for what? To obtain the promissory note? Loaned them what? What's money? So you should be, did they hand him the promissory note and say, for the record, no, the promissory note, and point to the dollar amount. I said, can you please read into the record how much legal tender or other depositors' money did the bank first have to loan the farmer before the bank legally owned this promissory note? Please tell us the dollar amount. Now, can you imagine him saying zero? If he says zero, you say, are you telling me the bank legally owns this promissory note and they loan zero legal tender, zero other depositors' money, and you expect the farmer to pay you back? He said, but we gave him a check. Now let me understand something right here. You have a check has to have funds behind it, isn't that correct? To make it, either cash or cash equivalent or actual cash value, something that can be sold for cash. And they're going to say yes. And did you receive this cash or cash equivalent from the farmer to fund this check? They're going to say yes. So let me get this stuff straight. You received either cash or cash value from the farmer that you used to fund this check, and you gave the check back to the farmer. So the farmer gave you something of value, you exchanged it for something else of equal value, and you gave it back to the farmer. Isn't that right? So you returned the money back to the farmer. Isn't that right? Okay, so you return the money back to the farmer. And they're going to say, well, yes, that's true. And I said, okay, then where's the loan? Well, the money we gave back to the farmer. You said you just returned what the farmer, you said the farmer gave something to the bank, they exchanged it for something of equal value, and you returned it to the farmer. Well, where was the money the bank loaned to the farmer? You said the bank loaned the farmer the money. We know where that $100,000 came from. The $100,000 the farmer got came from the farmer. Now we want to know where the money came from the bank that was loaned to the farmer. See how they can't really easily argue that argument? So this question she asked here, did you on direct say that the bank loaned defendants money? That's a very weak question. We want to know where that money came from. There's many different ways of asking that same question, so we want to come back. Well, of course he says yes. So she's asking very weak questions that he's able to dance around, have fun, and beat around the bush and not answer most of the questions as she's answering, so she's not getting what she wants out of this guy. Now, at the bottom of page 58, she asked the question, and where? Well, did the loan proceeds, the money that you loaned the farmer, come from other account, some other account? The bank president comes back and says, they came from a bank. Come from our pool of deposits. Beautiful, beautiful. See, 90% of the checking account balances came from what they call creating money in an alleged loan process. So this particular banker came back and says, well, it came from a pool of deposits. Now, as soon as they agree that the money came from a pool of deposits, I want you to make a note of this. Immediately in your mind, it should trigger in a certain question. Okay, money came from a certain pool of deposits. You want to come back and ask a no-win question so that banker is going to go down a slippery path again, right down very fast and go kaboom. You want to ask the questions that they cannot win. They cannot answer. No matter how they answered, they lost. So you want to simply ask a question. Mr. Banker, you believe in your opinion that if the farmer doesn't pay back on this loan and get the money back to the bank so the bank can pay back the original customers who brought the funds to the bank that were deposited, do you think the bank and those depositors, those customers at the bank would be damaged if that farmer didn't repay the loan? So that the bank could pay back those original depositors whose monies was accepted by the bank, recorded as a bank asset, offset by a bank liability, and used to fund loans to borrowers. Do you think that bank and those depositors would be damaged if that farmer doesn't pay back on this loan? Now, this bank president, he'll probably try to beat around the bush. He's not going to want to answer that question. He does. He pretty much lost the whole court case. So you can't sue anybody unless you have a damage. You got to have a damage. You got to say, I'm damaged. There's no damages, you can't sue. So as soon as they talk about they loaned out money from a pool of depositors, that's a beautiful thing. That'd be a great question. Mr. Banker, you loan out money from a pool of depositors whose customers, bank customers, came to the bank. The bank accepted those funds as a bank asset offset by bank liability, and that was deposited. You loan out those depositors money. And he's got to say yes. He can't say, no, we don't loan out depositors money. You're going to say, then where's the money come from? You can't answer that one either. Because see, when you have a conversion, you can't talk about the conversion part. And that's what we're going to talk. That's what we're headed for. Well, see, if he comes back and says, no, there's no damage whatsoever, then the farmer gets to stop making the loan payments because they're not damaged. If he doesn't pay, they're not damaged, so they can't sue, so therefore he doesn't have to pay back. Now, if the banker comes back and says, that's right, man, they're damaged, we're damaged. That's why we're suing the banker, because we got to foreclose. We got to get that money for those depositors. Wonderful. That means the farmer was damaged because he was the guy who the bank accepted his funds as a bank asset. The bank never returned the funds to him, never intended to it. The bank, in the whole history of the whole bank, they never gave back the funds to the original person who funded the loans. The whole history of the bank. So they have a policy, they have intent, they have procedures, they have a history. Guess what? They got a big problem now. That's the question that should have been asked about, pooling money in these deposits. It wasn't asked, it should have been. You probably could have wrapped up the whole court case right there. Let's go on to page number 59. Where would you show that the debit or liability for the money loaned? We credit his account, he answers. We have a debit for the loan. See, he just admitted. They took the promissory note, they recorded on the bank's books as an asset under the loan account, and they credited his account. He just admitted to this whole thing right here. So he just went down a slippery path right here, and I don't think, if you did the right things, I don't think he'd recover. He said, we put money in his account. Well, what he means by that, we put money into his account, you have a bank liability. You have a checking account balance. And so they increase your checking account balance by whatever was deposited as a bank asset. So the bank says, we owe you that $100, or we owe that $1,000 that was deposited. So you can either go back and get the cash, or you can write a check. Now, most people know that for the big purchases, you're going to write checks. You write checks out for your insurance, your car loan. your house loan, your taxes, which most of that's a national loan, and your utility bills. But if you're going to go buy McDonald's or buy bubble gum or things like this, you use the money in your pocket. So now he's switching, he's redefining money, and he's calling the bank liability money now. So you got to be real careful, these guys, because they are switching the definition of the word money. So now money is the opposite of money when he says we put money in your account. Unless he meant they put the promissory note as a bank asset, and that was the money that they deposited, and they credited the account, his checking account, saying the bank owes him the money. Now, if the bank owes him the money, and that bank liability is still remaining outstanding, which it does, they still never paid him the money. So now you can try to look at perjury, what this guy just got done stating. That's where you're going to need your expert witness to come in and destroy him when he says, we put the money in your account. We loaned you the money. He made those two statements. The money never came out of the bank because the bank liabilities increased. Money is recorded as a bank asset. A liability is owing money. So if you deposit something, there's a new asset, new liability. The asset and liability are matched. The back and says, but where is the source of the money? He says the deposits in the bank. Now, it sounds like he didn't answer the question, but he did really good. The bank president now just what? He made another mistake. He said the deposits in the bank. That was the source of the money. Well, don't you deposit cash? Don't you deposit checks? Obviously, here they deposited the promissory note because the deposits of the bank promissory note ended up as a bank asset. They loan out depositors' money, from what he said the earlier page. He said they come from a pool of deposits. Who provided that deposit? The farmer. So what should be the next question? So if a bank customer comes to the bank with funds and they're deposited in the bank, does the bank owe that customer the money? Yes. That's what the question should ask. So if the borrower doesn't pay back the bank and the bank, no, then you should say, well, okay, then, so those depositors' monies then are loaned out, right? And the borrower has to pay the bank back, and then the bank pays back those depositors. Isn't that correct? That is one of the final blows, final things that you're going to use to utterly destroy that banker. Because the minute he admits that that's correct, those original depositors, they got to get their money back. Guess what? He is really going down a slippery slope because he just got done admitting that he owes that farmer the $100,000. And now what do you want? You want the banker to pay you the money so that you can pay the money back to the banker. This was never brought out. It should have been brought out. It could have ended it right there before noon. That farmer could have walked away with probably a farm with nothing owed on it. Because we want the bank president to admit everything that we're saying is 100% correct. You want under oath, under testimony, tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth, that you are absolutely correct. Once he has that testimony, he can't say that you still owe him the money. So if you actually came out here and says, okay, so those depositors, you owe those depositors money, isn't that correct? And they're going to say yes, because that liability from these deposits say that, and he says right here, they deposit into his checking account. They deposit into his checking account, and there's a new asset that they received from the farmer, and there's a new liability, and that's into his checking account. So now you come back, and it was a pool of depositors, right? So they had to have deposited the promissory note. So what's the next question that you should be, look at all this, what's really being said. What's the next question? What's the most obvious thing you got to go back to end this thing before noon and have the farmer walk away and he owns the farm free and clear? So these depositors, so in other words, when the bank receives a deposit, the bank assets and liabilities increase. Is that correct? Okay? And you loan those depositors money out to borrowers. Isn't that correct? Yes. And they're going to have to say yes. And you owe money to these depositors, don't you? And he's going to have to say, well, yes. And if those depositors asked you for the money, would you pay the money? He's going to have to say yes. Now you find out that the farmer was the depositor. What does the farmer want to do at this point? Ask for the money from the bank, because there's a new bank debt saying they owe the money. It was deposited into his checking account. What was deposited into his checking account? Funds they received from the farmer. And the bank owes the money because it's a bank liability, owing money. They already established that. So now if he goes to the bank right there on the witness stand and says, I want my money, would you, if I ask the bank for the money, if a depositor asks the bank for the money, since you accept funds from depositors, you put it into their checking account. Isn't that correct? Okay. So if you accept funds from a depositor, you accept those funds as a bank asset offset by bank liability into their checking account. Isn't that correct? And if you accept funds from a person into their checking account and you credit their checking account, should the customer have an idea what's going on? And they'd say yes. You're telling me that the bank customer has knowledge as to what the transaction is? Yes. So if the bank accepts funds from a customer and they credit their checking account, and the customer withdraws money from that checking account, how much money did the bank loan? Except, let's say the customer comes in, they deposit $10,000. The bank credits their checking account by $10,000, and they make a loan. I mean, not make a loan. They credit the checking account by $10,000, and the customer withdraws the $10,000. How much did the bank loan the customer, in your opinion? Now, you said earlier that they loaned money. Now, earlier when you talked about depositing $1,000 and withdrawing $100, that the bank still owes $900 because there's a bank liability owing the $900. So this $10,000 credit is the scorecard, really, how much the bank owes that customer. Isn't that correct? So if the bank owes $10,000, that means the bank owes a $10,000 asset. Isn't that correct? Okay. So if somebody withdraws that money from that checking account, how much money did the bank really loan that customer? See, they don't want to answer that. Now, you want to talk about how they changed the cost and how they changed the risk, because if you funded the loan to yourself and had to pay back a third party, the principal and the interest, wouldn't that change the cost and the risk compared to if the bank funded the loan and you had to pay back the original person who funded the loan? So you want to come back and basically say, okay, isn't it true, Mr. Banker, that this farmer's got to pay back the original person who actually provided the capital to fund the bank loan check? Isn't that the ultimate thing that we're trying to do right here? And they're going to have to say yes. They can't say no to a question like that. So she comes back with the question, so actually, what was loaned was credit and not money. No, get off this credit versus money. Credit's the postponement of the payment of money. Money is the medium of exchange. That comes from Richmond Federal Reserve Bank publication, Your Money, and also another publication called Art Money, and both publications is on page 18. Both come from Richmond. Don't get into that in front of this judge. All we care about is we want the person who originally funded this loan to get their money back. That's all we're interested in. We're interested in one thing. We want the bank president to admit they don't legally own the promissory note, and the money credit issue is not going to get us what we want. It's just going to simply irritate the judge, and we're not going to get what we want. So stick on point with what we're trying to accomplish. Don't go off in different tangents. That's where people lose court cases. All right, next one. She asks, but where's the source of the money? The deposits in the bank. See, when it means the deposits of the bank, that means the promissory note had to have been deposited. So when they say from the deposits of the bank, so you want to come back and see, the banker wants you to believe that they really loaned you other depositors money. So play on that. Use that to your advantage. You want to say, okay, so it comes from the depositors. And do those depositors expect to get, if those deposits were loaned out, do those depositors who brought funds to the bank that were deposited, do they expect to get their money back? And he's going to have to say yes. Can you imagine the bank president says, oh, no. Those depositors will never get their money back. We never intended them to get their money back because we stole their money. And we're going to keep it, so we can't, give their money back because we stole it. Can you imagine him trying to say something like that? Now, I'm not trying to say this guy's a thief or a crook or anything like that. He's just going along with the way they set these things up. And I believe it's very, very deceptive. And if people understood it, I don't think people would allow it to continue for very long. All right, so when they're talking about a deposit, the banker's thinking a liability, so they increase the liability of the checking account. But when we're talking about a deposit, you come back and say, well, if I deposit cash at a bank, the cash is recorded as an asset, right? Offset by a new bank liability. Just so we understand each other, right? Isn't that correct? Okay. So if there's a deposit at a bank, there's a new asset and liability. Isn't that correct? And isn't it true that no money can get into a checking account unless it's first deposited? That's the question you want to ask. Because if he says yes to that, then no money can get into a checking account unless money's first deposited. And guess what? They credited his checking account by putting an asset promissory note, and that means the promissory note is money, and they credited his checking account, so the promissory note was deposited. So now all we are interested in is if a bank customer comes in with funds the bank accepts as a deposit, and they credit their checking account, does that mean the bank owes them the money for those funds deposited, yes or no? And they're going to have to say yes. And it's the bank's big, keen interest in having borrowers pay the money back to the bank so the bank can pay back these depositors whose funds was earlier loaned out. Isn't that the bank's interest in doing that? And they're going to have to say yes. At that point in time, the banker is pretty much defeated. But you might need your own expert witness to bring home and drive home the point. But now, under oath, this banker is defeated. They've admitted now what they had to do to own the promissory note. They didn't meet that qualification. They admitted that they received a deposit from you, and they owe you the money. Well, owing money is not money. We just established that. And we can't figure out where the money was that they loaned, and they said they had to loan X amount of dollars to first loan those legal tender to obtain ownership of the promissory note. There's not too many places that banker can go at that point in time. That banker has a real problem. But see, this was not brought out right here. They touched on it in this court case, and they got about 10% of the value that they really needed. We really should have brought home the other 90%. We should have brought the whole ship home instead of just parking it out on the street. You need to put the car in the garage and not park it out front to bring home this whole idea. You got to get that banker to admit what you're saying is correct. It's more powerful to have the banker admit he does not own the promissory note than it is for your CPA expert witness to admit he does not own the promissory note. Banking is black and white. There's only so many terminology. They're going to say a deposit is an increase to the checking account balance. And you're going to, as they doing this, I said, well, if I deposit cash, the cash is recorded as a bank asset. Isn't that correct? They're going to have to say yes. So when they increase the bank liabilities, it simply means the bank owes an offsetting bank asset to the depositor. Isn't that correct? And they're going to have to say yes. At that point in time, they got a problem, especially if they admit they loan out depositors money. The minute they admit they loan out depositors money and they have to deposit money to increase the checking account balances, that means they either deposited the promissory note or they sold the promissory note before they loaned a cent for it, sold it for cash, deposited the cash. And then they return the value back to you as a loan. Now, one of the other things a banker might try to do to get this thing all twisted and convoluted is they might say, well, we did loan other depositors money. We took other depositors money, we credited the cash, and we deposited the promissory note. We exchanged the cash for promissory note, and we gave the cash to the seller of the property, so they could buy it and whatever. Now, that sounds correct until you really look at the bookkeeping entries, and what did I show in the book? And again, you cannot listen to these cassette tapes unless you purchase them. That's a contractual agreement. Nobody else can listen to them. If you do, you're involved in deceptive trade practices and theft of trade secrets. And you're in receipt of stolen goods and property. You cannot copy these cassette tapes. Nobody else can listen to these cassette tapes unless you have a contractual agreement you signed with Tom Schaaf. And you purchase these tapes. I've been known to cut off whole groups that have lied on this. Because if you lie on this, you're going to lie on something else, and I won't work with you. Because if you want the bank to keep their agreement, you have to keep the agreement with me. And I'm doing this partly because if you start copying these tapes and you give it out to a friend, they're going to copy and they're going to give it out to another friend. Pretty soon it's going to end up in the hands of a banker. So as soon as I find out somebody's copied it, you're in trouble because you have damaged me big time. All right, let's kind of go on right here. So you want to talk about these deposits. And they can't discuss this. They can't really talk about that. Now they got some double talk going on here on page 59 at the bottom. It says, and would you not say that they have value to the farmer? Meaning the promissory note. Banker comes back and says he received value from them. When you made them, he received value for the loan. Well, that's a bad question because trading a promissory note for promissory note, IOU for IOU, they can claim as receiving value for them. Sometimes that's why they say in the bank loan agreement, they say, for value or consideration received. And they stay away from saying they actually made a loan. But interest means for the charge of the use of borrowed money. So anytime they're charging interest, that means they loaned you their money according to the definition of the word interest. So trying to slip and slide and use these different definitions to try and get you to think one thing when really the exact opposite really occurred. So you come back and say, so you loaned him money on a worthless piece of paper is that what I'm understanding you to say? Don't say that. That's a bad question. It's argumentative. You're going to get the judge all upset at you, and you're not going to get very far on this. You might ask him, do you believe that the farmer and the bank agreed to exchange loan for loan? The farmer loaned the bank something, and the bank take the value of that and loan it, exchange it for something of equal value and loan it back to the farmer. Do you believe something like that was to occur? Well, if the bank wasn't loaned something, then how did you end up with a new liability? Oh, it was a deposit. Okay. So you received funds from the farmer that was deposited, and you credited his checking account and recorded a new bank asset. Okay. If the bank accepted a deposit from the farmer, do you believe the bank loaned the farmer anything at that point in time? Okay, if the farmer takes funds to the bank accepts them as a deposit, and they credit his checking account, and the farmer withdraws the money, do you believe the bank loaned any asset to the farmer of any asset the bank had prior, owned, other than the deposit that the bank received from the farmer? And of course they can't say yes. So in other words, the bank loaned nothing of value. No, so you're telling me the bank never loaned one asset to the bank's assets to obtain ownership of the promissory note. Is that what you're telling me? Okay, on page 60 at the top, the paralegal is asking some more questions. She's saying, if the loan is an asset, is the promissory note an asset? See, the loan account, they're trying to say, is an asset. So that the banker comes back and says, well, they're one and the same. Now she asks another question. If they are one and the same, then you loaned him his promissory note back. That's kind of a bad question. He doesn't answer the question again and comes back and says, the promissory note is an asset on the bank's books. She asks, and the loan is an asset? He comes back and says, they're one and the same. An asset and promissory note are one and the same. So you can redefine anything to mean you want. You can call a man a woman a man. You can say black is white, red is blue. But you can redefine it any way you want. But a man is still a man, and a woman is still a woman, and black is black, and blue is blue, and bitter is bitter, and sweet is sweet, and woe to those who call sweet bitter and bitter sweet. Start redefining mean the opposite, and that's what the guy's doing here. Question on page number 60. And if you handed me a promissory note, would you be handing me a loan? I don't understand what she means by that question, but he comes, that's right, if you sign it, we accept it. So is the check that you gave the farmer, he comes back and says, we gave him a deposit slip. So see, they deposited the promissory note because they gave him back a deposit slip. You gave him a deposit slip, which does that comport with line of credit? I don't know what she means. He says no. Question, so you gave him a deposit slip in exchange for his promissory note. That is correct. Now that was a good question because you got him to admit there was an exchange and you called it a loan. So he admitted now there was an exchange. So your CPA expert witness now needs to pick up on this. And this is why you need to put these people into a deposition prior to court. So your expert witness can use their testimony to destroy them. Can you imagine your CPA writing out a CPA report and says, well, the banker admitted to this, admitted this, just like I'm going through this right now. Can you imagine, having fun like that? Oh, that'd be a lot of fun. Question. So then does the farmer owe you money? Yes. In other words, he's saying yes. Because of the note, we gave him the money in his account. He used the money to pay his bills or whatever. So now they made an exchange, value for value, and he's calling it a loan. Page 61. In fact, we're going to go on to the next cassette tape here in just a moment. But I'm on page 61. So really, there were two loans exchanged because the bank made a loan to the farmer, but the bank also received a negotiable instrument or promissory note or commercial paper, something having actual value as an asset offset by bank liability, which means it was either deposited or loaned to the bank. So there's two loans exchanged. Remember, Modern Money Mechanics, page number 6, it says an exchange. That's right. The loan to the bank is the promissory note, is an asset, new liability, and the loan back to the farmer is when they took the check and used the check to exchange the liability from one checking account to another checking account. Okay, we're going to go on to the next cassette tape. Remember, Tom Schaff, www.bankfreedom.com. Let's go on to the next cassette tape. Thank you.